In the middle of the Cold War, a standoff between Cuba and the United States of America began. Cuba had become allies with the Soviet Union, who the United States was currently at war with. The Soviet Union built a missile base near San Cristobal, Cuba, which was only 90 miles from the coast of Florida. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the most dangerous encounter between the U.S. and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, began. The Cold War, a conflict between the United States of America and the Soviet Union over their systems of government, among other things, was the reason the Cuban Missile Crisis began, and therefore a huge part of its story. The beginning of the Cold War was an arms race, with the two countries trying to one-up each other with nuclear weaponry. Day 1 of the 13-day crisis, October 14th, kicks off with a bang, as the President of the United States, President John F. Kennedy, is briefed on what an American U-2 fighter photographed in Cuba. These photographs are of nuclear missile sites in Cuba, brought there by the Soviet Union. The President brings together a committee to decide what actions they should take in accordance with this new threat so close to home. Kennedy's team, known as EXCOM, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, discussed 5 different possibilities on how to handle the situation at hand. 2 of the options lead to the certain doom of the United States, and possibly the world. Another 2 options, one of which is not responding at all, which, if the public heard about the crisis, may lead to panic. The other way is through diplomatic relations, which may have worked, but Kennedy also had the option of blockading the Soviets from getting into Cuba. While Kennedy is trying to decide which option is the best to deal with the problem, an American U-2 fighter obtains more photographs of the missiles. From these photographs, it is revealed that the missiles reached up to 2,200 nautical miles, almost 30 times the distance between the missiles and the United States. This only adds to the urgency of the situation. Andrei Gromyko, foreign minister of the USSR, tells Kennedy that the missiles stationed in Cuba are there only if the United States ever attacked Cuba. Kennedy tells Gromyko that if any missiles were launched towards the U.S., there would be consequences toward their actions. Kennedy also believed that Gromyko was lying.
Days 6 and 7 were omitted due to the fact that they were only debate days and nothing seriously actually happened.
Kennedy had decided to use a blockade, keeping Soviet ships from transporting any more missiles and materials to Cuba. This may have been seen as an act of war, but Kennedy named this a quarantine. Congress has shown the photographs of the missiles. The President also informs the nation through TV and radio broadcasting about the crisis. The nation believes that war is coming. Kennedy officially enacts the quarantine. He received a letter from Khrushchev stating that this blockade is a serious threat to peace between the two countries. JFK's brother, Robert Kennedy, meets with Anatoly Dobryan, the ambassador of the USSR. The United States military, for the first time in U.S. history, goes into DEFCON 2 along the coast of Florida. George Ball, a member of EXCOM, tells the U.S. ambassadors in Turkey that a deal is being made in which the U.S. would remove nuclear missiles from Turkey. In exchange, the USSR would remove their missiles from Cuba. Khrushchev later sent a message to Kennedy stating that the ship shall ignore the blockade and continue to Cuba. This is where the story of the man who saved the world begins. Imagine being a Soviet naval officer delivering nuclear missiles to Cuba. On your way there, you're told to stop and don't move anywhere but below you. You lower into the depth of the Gulf of Mexico with no way of communicating with anyone outside of your sub. Then the air conditioning goes off. While waiting to hear any news from the communication you don't have, bam, a depth charge rattles your sub. Vasily Arkhipov is a flotilla commander for the Russian sub sending these missiles to Cuba. He had these same conditions. The way this went down is somewhat of a mystery. We know that the submarine Arkhipov was on did have a nuclear torpedo on board. We also know that the submarine had reached temperatures of over 100 degrees, well over what the temperature was supposed to be. American naval ships dropped charges as they knew the subs were somewhere below them. Commander Valentin Savitsky believed that the Americans were attacking them. He also believed that, as he says, maybe the war has already started up there. We're gonna blast them now. Arkhipov believed that the Americans were only setting signal charges to make the Russians reveal themselves. The debate between the two was brutal, yet we don't know what was actually said. Savitsky got the other captain to agree with him. It said that in order for a Soviet nuclear torpedo to be launched, permission must be granted by the leaders in Russia or unanimous vote by the 3 captains on the sub with missiles, if they deemed the situation necessary. This left Arkhipov with a huge decision on his hands. Arkhipov decided to stick with what he thought was right and not send the missile into the naval blockade, which may have led to nuclear war between the United States and the USSR. This led to possibly hours of arguments between Arkhipov and Savitsky. However, this outcome was probably the best outcome. If nuclear war had come from 3 men's decision on whether the war had already started or not, Arkhipov had saved the world by denying something that couldn't ever be proved in the conditions they were in. Arkhipov would die from kidney cancer in 1998. The irony is that many believe the cancer was caused from exposure to nuclear radiation 1 year before. Khrushchev sends another letter to Kennedy, another letter calling him a hypocrite for being scared of Cuba while keeping missiles in Turkey. Khrushchev also makes a deal. If the Americans remove their missiles from Turkey, the Soviets will remove theirs from Cuba. The United Nations are to check and see if the missiles are removed from both nations. Then, tragedy strikes. An American U-2 pilot, Rudolph Anderson, is shot and killed over Cuba. This increases the tensions of the Cold War. President Kennedy decides not to retaliate and see if the event happens again. Kennedy asked the Soviets to stop building to negotiate with XCOM on the matter. Later that night, Kennedy announced that the US will not invade Cuba or Russia if the missiles are pulled out. Many Americans had a rough time going to sleep that night. Khrushchev announces that the missiles will be removed if the ones in Turkey are removed. Kennedy agrees. The Cuban Missile Crisis is over, and now compromise can begin. The aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis had changed the way we viewed the USSR and how they viewed us. The compromise of the crisis began with the tensions of the superpowers weakening in 1963. This led to a phone line that connected the Oval Office in Washington, D.C. to Moscow. On July 25, 1963, the United States and the Soviet Union signed the limited nuclear test ban. This prevented many conflicts that could have happened between the two. The rest of the Cold War consisted of the continuation of the arms race. They also continued the space race, where the two would race to the moon. The Soviet Union would collapse on December 26, 1991, thus ending the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis is considered to be the most heated moment of the Cold War. The conflict between the two most influential superpowers had shaken up so many people around the globe. Just try to imagine the world if one Soviet naval officer had decided to agree with his equals to launch a nuclear torpedo at U.S. naval boats, or if John F. Kennedy decided to launch missiles at Cuba after hearing about a pilot being shot down. The conflict may seem to be overwhelming, but considering the outcome of the situation, the outcome is very beneficial to both American and Soviet societies.